Good morning, everyone from Kamloops, British Columbia. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here today. Some opening points. There is a major problem in front of us. To align with some of what Mr. Zeman said, what we are doing is not working for our Pacific salmon. Many of the populations are in serious conservation decline. What slipped under the radar last year because of the attention going to Big Bar is last year was the worst coastwide Pacific salmon return ever. It was the worst sockeye return on the Fraser ever. Worse than what triggered the Cohen Commission of Inquiry. Failure to take action now is likely to result in many of our Pacific salmon populations following a path similar to what happened to our East Coast cod, and we all know that story. In terms of thinking about what to do, we have to take a long view. Recovery is going to take time, and I don't believe there are simple answers, but it is possible to do things to make things better for our salmon. There are some good things happening. I think some of the recent funding programs that have gone on, going back to under the Conservative government, the RFCPP, under the current Liberal government, Oceans Protection Plan are positive things. In particular, most recently, the BC Salmon Restoration Innovation Fund is positive because the collaboration between the federal government and provincial government is the kind of thing we need to do. However, we need to recognize that the problems are big, they're long-term. This funding over 5 years, while it is useful, is not the kind of scale or duration that we need to solve the problem. Other things like restoring lost protections is a positive step, but we need to follow that up with action. I think it's important to recognize that salmon ecology is really complicated. There aren't simple answers. There are issues with predation. There are issues with habitat. There are issues with fishing. There are sub-components to these issues, and there is no single thing that if we do this, everything will be better. A way I like to look at what we can do for salmon is to think about the ocean is the big driver of what enables salmon populations to swing up and down. This is part of a natural cycle, probably changing because of climate change. But we as people can do things managing what a lot of biologists call the 3 H's: harvest, habitat, and hatcheries. And I'm going to speak to that in a little bit of detail. And to combine with that, I think we also need to think about having information and data, and we need to continue with the science to understand what's going on. And I'll speak to these all very quickly. In terms of harvest, we know that harvest has been reduced. We heard that from Mr. Walters already this morning. And we know that access and opportunity are very, very important to the constituents. However, we need to start to think about how we unlock the access to that fishery. It's currently locked up primarily because weak populations are co-migrating with populations that are stronger. We need better information, better management science, better monitoring, and better assessment so that we can access the fisheries and the populations that are healthy and protect those that are weak. And participants in the fishery, First Nations, public and commercial, have capacity to bring to the table. Turning to hatcheries, I would say that not every hatchery is the same. What I would suggest that we need right now is attention to conservation-focused hatchery capacity. This is different than producing fish to go catch. This is different than dumping a lot of fish out into the ocean hoping something good happens. This is a very specific thing designed to bolster weak populations while we figure out what the problem is and make things better. So a rush to increase hatchery production is unlikely to get us the outcomes that we want. So I think we do have an urgent need for conservation-focused hatchery. We need to turn those on quickly for things like Big Bar, and it's going to take tens of millions of dollars, and we need to run them for 2 decades. Turning briefly now to habitat, we need to protect what we have. We need to fix past damage. We need to be strategic and not reactive, and we need to be coordinated and not siloed. There are many good things out there in terms of what we can do for habitat, but we are not taking the kind of action that we need to do. Sorry, I'm just following some of my PowerPoint slides here. I've got a number of recommendations that I will follow up with in writing, but we really need to start establishing watershed-based habitat plans and delivering on those kinds of things. In terms of monitoring, assessment, and data, to summarize, we can't manage what we don't measure. We're not monitoring enough, and we're not measuring enough. We need to pay attention to ocean ecology and science so we know what's happening out there. And in summary, what I would say is the overall management system is not working. The sum of the parts is not allowing us to understand what's going on, put them together, and solve the problem. We are saying the right kinds of things. We have Cohen Commissions of Inquiry. We have wild salmon policy, but we are not getting the outcomes we need. The government of Canada needs to set goals for salmon recovery and sustainability and take responsibility for achieving those goals and taking appropriate action. So in summary, I would say that significant new investment is required into the 3H levers: harvest, hatcheries, and habitat. New dollars need to go into DFO as well as to collaborators and partners, and the management system needs to be revitalized. Consideration should be given to an independent oversight body to complement the work that DFO and other regulatory agencies are bringing forward. I will stop there, and I think I've fit within my 6 minutes. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
You know, the question is, if we look at the health of the fish, not just the number of fish, but the health of the fish and the health of the things that the fish eat, where are we on that? You know, especially the herring, the plankton, the things that fish like to eat, are they as in tough shape as the fish themselves? Maybe, I don't know, Mr. Hwang, have you got any thoughts on that?
That's a giant question, Mr. Hardy. I think in summary, the ocean is changing from what we have been used to. Mr. Walters has spoken to that to some degree and would have more probably in-depth ability to comment on that. But some of the herring populations are in decline, some are doing well, but it's a massive and complex issue in terms of the ecological interaction.
Could you please prioritize what, in your opinion, should be considered? I know it's a complex domain, it depends on the species and the water, but what measures, and that includes funding as well, what measures should be prioritized to have a positive impact in the longer term?
I would say that it is about taking action. We have lots of plans on the shelf, and they are acted on in components that are convenient and generally short-term and not funded for the duration and the completeness that we need to be able to manage well and actually do the things that are required to facilitate recovery. So there is a significant lack of resources, a significant lack of coordination, significant lack of accountability, not because the people involved aren't good at what they do, but the system as a whole is not getting us the results that we need. And Mr. Chair, if there's a little bit more time, another piece that I'd like to highlight is the need for the federal government and provincial government to cooperate. While the federal government has a mandate for salmon, the provincial government's got the constitutional authority for land and water. You can't be successful in getting what you need for salmon without being successful at managing land and water in ways that lead to those sustainable outcomes. And the federal and provincial cooperation is an absolute necessity in order to get that outcome.
Maybe I'll start with you, Mr. Hwang. You talked about harvest, habitat, and hatcheries. Can you speak about the scale in which the government is rolled out in the, you cited the BC Salmon Restoration Fund and highlighted the importance of that funding. We saw in the first round that there was $340 million in applications just for the first round alone. And the government rolled out half of the fund, less than half of the fund on that. Can you talk about the scale that's needed and how far off the mark the governments are right now for what's necessary? We heard from Chief Patrick Harry and Greg Witzke yesterday, and their applications, many of them have been denied. And they're saying that we're looking at extinction if we're not investing in restoration and habitat protection right now.
Well, thank you for the question, Mr. Johns. I would say, just to preface my response, there are some situations where there is a critical urgency because of the state of the populations. The big bar problem has highlighted some of those things, but there were problems of that nature even without big bar. Mr. Zeman spoken to the steelhead problems. There has been a Fraser or Southern BC Chinook problem. There have been Sockeye problems, coho problems. So I believe there are some things that need to be done fairly urgently that would require a significant investment now, and there are things that need to be done long-term that require ongoing substantive investment. In relation to the scale of the BC SRIF, the kind of numbers that were put into that, $140 million-ish over 5 years, are, I would suggest, in the range of an order of magnitude below what is needed to do all of the things that I think the collection of witnesses today have spoken about. We need to do the science, assessment, and monitoring. We need to look after habitat. We need to manage hatcheries, and we need to properly manage harvest. To do all of those things, you wouldn't even be able to get at all of that if you put $50 million additional a year into the system for 10 years. It would be a great start, but you're talking in that scale, $500 million. And that would be a target that wouldn't even let you do everything that every witness today has spoken to. So I hope that gives you some degree of answer to your question.
Do you feel that there's a sense of urgency from the government? They're looking at Big Bar. We see this crisis that's taking place, but really the crisis before that, we had the half of the lowest return in recorded history. And do you feel the government's responding to that quick enough? And in regards to Big Bar, maybe you can speak a bit about that. We saw the delay in the rollout of the tendering process and the work that was necessary there. Yesterday we heard from, or Tuesday we heard from Hewitt, and they were citing that tendering would need to go out now, and the engineering to put in fish ladders and whatnot to be in place for next season immediately almost. Do you feel that the government's moving at the pace that's necessary to save those stocks for next season?
I will say that the work that's ongoing this summer, I am very pleased to see it. They are ready for when the fish get there. The fish are having trouble because of the natural high water, but they're in a good place right now. What I am not sure about and have some concern until I'm able to see the action is what is in place to get ready for the fall and winter to take advantage of the low water period where additional work can be done, because the problem isn't solved yet. So in order to be able to take best advantage of the work season, the financial approvals need to be in place and the procurement system needs to be activated. I don't know if those are in place or not, but a high priority should be placed on having those done very much in advance so that those kinds of administrative functions are not delaying taking action on the ground.
Question out to all of our witnesses. What structural changes would you make to DFO to make it more responsive to stakeholders and more effective in addressing the very real challenges facing our West Coast salmon stocks?
Mr. Fast, I would suggest that one of the recommendations from Cohen was around having a associate RDG position that would be responsible for implementing the findings. One of the challenges the DFO has is the integration of a lot of the good work that happens within the department. So I would say helping with that integration, having some independent oversight would really help with the accountability, because as someone who was a longtime public servant, working in this space between what the political pressures are, the public pressures are, and the realities of what you can do with the money you have is very difficult. And it's hard to have a voice in terms of what is possible to change and make better. And having a place that can test that and check that can help us get the best that we can out of the department.
Mr. Hwang, one of the things that we've looked at in the past is the development, especially along the Fraser River, and individual projects are approved or assessed, but we don't get the sense that anybody's keeping good tabs on the cumulative impact of all of these individual decisions that are made.
Well, Mr. Hardy, there's a couple of things I would add to that. One is that Pacific Salmon Foundation, we do have a platform that is on the way to being able to do that, where you can use this thing called the Pacific Salmon Explorer to at least see habitat pressures broadly. It doesn't get to the specific point that you're talking about that fully summarizes the cumulative effects, but at least we are starting to have technology to allow us to understand what we have. But you're on a very important point that we don't really have targets. What do we want for habitat? And if we don't have a target, how do you know if you're where you want to be? And so those targets are really, really important. And I have to emphasize that the British Columbia is a key part of the equation. DFO has management authority for salmon and salmon habitat. BC manages land and water. Those are the same thing. And they have to cooperate to get the outcomes we need.
Turn to Mr. Hwang, because I haven't asked you any questions yet, and your perspective on the 3 H's struck me as very good advice. With those 3 H's, is there any one more important than the other?
No. It's like saying, what's the most important thing for human health? Do I need water? Do I need air? Do I need food? You know, you're not whole, you're not healthy unless you have it all.